Korean Mafia Boss sheltered a homeless girl. 15 years later, she walked into court and became his judge. The bailiff called the courtroom to order. All rise for the Honorable Judge Se-yeon Choi. Tae-sung's lawyer turned to him in confusion. Did you know a Choi was presiding over this case? Tae-sung said nothing. He was staring at the woman walking to the bench in black robes, and she was staring right back at him with a face he had not seen in 15 years. Your Honor, the prosecutor said, we'd like to note for the record that the defendant's last name is also Choi. Is there a relation the court should be aware of? Se-yeon set down her folder. She did not blink. There is no relation the court needs to disclose that would affect these proceedings, she said. I have no father in this room. I only have a defendant. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman gasped. Tae-sung's hands, folded on the table in front of him, began to shake for the first time in 30 years. That was the moment the entire country would replay for months. But to understand how a homeless girl ended up on the bench deciding the fate of the man who once fed her, we have to go back. And if you want to help the channel, leave a like and subscribe. It takes less than a second and help the channel a lot. 15 years to a warehouse on the edge of Incheon, and a winter so cold it made grown men flinch just walking to their cars. The cold that November did not fall gently over Incheon. It arrived like a verdict, sudden and absolute, sinking into concrete and steel until the entire dockyard felt like it had been carved from ice. Choi Tae-sung stood at the edge of Warehouse 7 with his coat collar raised, watching two of his men argue over a shipment that had gone missing somewhere between Busan and here. He did not raise his voice. He rarely needed to. Men who worked for Tae-sung learned quickly that his silence was more dangerous than another man's shouting. He had built his organization on precision. Every shipment tracked, every debt recorded, every betrayal answered before it could spread. That was the world Choi Tae-sung understood. Numbers, consequences, order enforced by whatever means were necessary. It was not a world with room for surprises. Which was why, when one of his men mentioned that Warehouse 3 had been showing signs of forced entry for the better part of a week, Tae-sung decided to check it himself rather than delegate it to someone else. The warehouse was empty of product, used mostly for storage of equipment nobody needed anymore. The door had been pried open at the corner, just enough for someone small to slip through. Tae-sung stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through dust and shadow, and found her sitting against a stack of old crates with her knees pulled to her chest. She could not have been older than 9. Her clothes were too thin for the season, her lips cracked from cold, and there was a fading bruise along her jaw that had nothing to do with the warehouse. She looked up at him, and there was no fear in her eyes. There was calculation. I'm not here to hurt you, Tae-sung said. That's what people say right before they do, she answered. Her voice did not shake. It was flat, practiced, the voice of someone who had learned to negotiate before she had learned to trust. He crouched down slowly, keeping distance between them. What's your name? She studied him for a long moment before answering. Se-yeon. Se-yeon. Are you alone? For now, she said, which told him everything and nothing at once. He noticed the way her eyes kept flicking toward the door, toward the street beyond it, as if she were tracking an exit that had nothing to do with him. He had seen that look before on men who worked for him after a job had gone wrong. It was the look of someone still running from something they had not outrun yet. Who are you hiding from? He asked. She did not answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its flatness. Someone who was supposed to take care of me. He didn't. Tae-sung had removed men from the world for far less than what her tone implied. He kept his face still, though something in his chest had gone cold in a way the November wind had nothing to do with. I have men outside, he said. I can make sure whoever that is never finds you again. She looked at him with the same assessment she had given him from the start, weighing the offer the way she might weigh a trap. I don't want revenge, she said. I want somewhere he can't reach. That's all. Nothing else. It was such a specific request, so carefully worded, that Tae-sung understood immediately she had thought about this moment long before he ever opened that door. She had not been hoping to be rescued. She had been planning what she would ask for if rescue ever arrived. Two of his men appeared behind him then, drawn by the light. One reached toward her instinctively, the way you might reach for a stray animal you were trying to help. Se-yun moved back against the crates so fast she nearly toppled them. Her arms coming up in a way that told Tae-sung this was not the first time a stranger's hand had reached for her without permission. "Don't," Tae-sung said, and his man froze immediately. He crouched lower, bringing himself eye level with her, closer to her height than his own considerable one. "Nobody touches you unless you say it's all right," he told her. "Not my men. Not me. Understood?" She looked at him for a long moment, something in her posture loosening by a fraction. "Understood," she repeated, testing the word like it was unfamiliar in her mouth. He brought her back to his estate that night, not out of charity, he told himself, but because a girl hiding from something dangerous in his warehouse was a liability he needed to manage directly. That was the lie he told himself in the car, watching her in the rearview mirror as she sat perfectly still, cataloging the city passing outside her window with the same careful attention she had given him in the warehouse. His housekeeper nearly dropped a tray of tea when Tae-sung walked through the door with a child trailing 3 steps behind him, refusing to let the gap close to 2. "She stays," Tae-sung said, before anyone could ask a single question. "Get her food. Real food. Not something you hand a beggar so you can feel like you've done something." The housekeeper returned minutes later with a full plate, rice and grilled fish and soup still steaming from the stove. More food than Se-yun had likely seen in one place in months. She set it down in front of the girl and stepped back. What happened next made even Tae-sung's men go quiet. Se-yun did not eat like a child sitting down to dinner. She ate like someone who did not trust the food to still be there in the next second. Her hand shot out and grabbed the rice first, not with a spoon, just her fingers, shoving it into her mouth in amounts too large to properly chew. She did not look up. She did not pause between bites. Her shoulders were curled forward over the plate, her arm curved around it in a way that Tae-sung recognized immediately, though it took him a moment to place why. It was the same posture he had seen in prison, in men who had done time in facilities where food was currency, where a slower eater simply went hungry. The housekeeper, meaning well, reached out gently. "Slow down, sweetheart. You'll make yourself sick," she said, and touched Se-yun's shoulder. Se-yun flinched so violently she nearly knocked the plate off the table, her whole body jerking sideways, her free arm snapping up over her head in a motion that was not thinking, was not decided, was simply reflex, the kind of reflex a body only learns after it has been hit enough times that the hand goes up before the mind understands why. For a full second she stayed like that, arm raised, eyes wide, breathing hard, waiting for a blow that did not come. The housekeeper froze, her hand still hovering in the air, horror spreading across her face, as she understood exactly what she had just witnessed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Se-yun lowered her arm slowly, her eyes flicking around the room, cataloging every face, checking who had seen. When she realized every single person in that kitchen had seen exactly what her body had just told them without her permission, something in her expression cracked, just slightly, just enough for Tae-sung to see the shame underneath it before she buried it again. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was smaller than it had been all night. "You can eat slow here," Tae-sung said quietly. "Nobody is going to take it from you. Nobody is going to hit you for how fast or slow you eat. Not in this house." She looked at him for a long moment, and he watched her decide whether or not to believe him, the same calculation she had made beneath the warehouse light 3 hours earlier. She did not eat slower. Not that night. Old habits do not dissolve because someone says a kind sentence out loud. But she did stop flinching every time someone in the room shifted their weight, and by the time the plate was empty, scraped clean enough that it barely needed washing, she allowed the housekeeper to bring her a second one without pulling away. Tae-sung stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, a man who had ordered violence without blinking more times than he could count, and found himself unable to move, unable to speak, undone entirely by the sight of a 9-year-old girl eating like she was afraid the world might take it back at any moment. It would be 3 more months before she ate a full meal at a normal pace in front of another person. It would be over a year before she stopped sleeping with her back against the wall of her room, facing the door. Taesung never mentioned either detail to her directly. He simply made sure every single night for years afterward that dinner was on the table at the same time in the same place without fail, so that she would eventually come to understand, in whatever way a body learns these things, that this particular meal at least was never going to disappear. It took 3 months before anyone in the house heard her speak again beyond single words. It took 3 more before Taesung understood why. He found her one evening in his study, a room his own lieutenants entered only with permission, standing in front of a wall of legal documents his lawyers had left behind after a meeting. She was reading a contract meant for men twice her age with decades of business experience, her finger moving slowly along a clause about liability transfer. "This is wrong," she said without turning around. Taesung set down the drink in his hand. "Excuse me, this clause." She tapped the page. "It says the company isn't responsible if something happens during transport. But further down it says they control every part of the transport. If you control something completely, you can't say you're not responsible for what happens to it. That's not a loophole. That's just lying with better paperwork." Taesung stood in the doorway of his own study, momentarily unable to produce a response, which had not happened to him since before he had built his first company at 19. "How old are you?" he asked finally. "9," she said. "Almost 10. Where did you learn to read contracts?" She turned to face him then, and there was something unervingly steady in her expression for a child her age. "Nobody explains rules to people like me," she said. "So I learned to read them myself. That way nobody can lie to me about what they say." It was in that moment, watching a 9-year-old dismantle a legal document his own attorneys had drafted, that Taesung understood he had not simply taken in a child who needed shelter. He had taken in something else entirely, something he did not yet have a word for, though 15 years later, standing before her in a courtroom, he would understand it perfectly. The years that followed were not gentle ones, not in the way people imagine when they picture a reformed criminal raising an orphan out of guilt. Taesung did not become a different man overnight. His business continued exactly as it had before, shipments moving through ports under the cover of legitimate paperwork, debts collected with the same quiet efficiency that had built his reputation. What changed was smaller, more private, contained almost entirely to the hours he spent at home with a girl who watched everything and forgave nothing. By 11, Se-yeon had stopped flinching when his men entered rooms. By 12, she had started arguing with them. "That's not fair," she told one of his lieutenants, a broad-shouldered man named Han Du-shik who had a reputation for handling discipline within the organization personally. He had been describing, at dinner, how he had dealt with a junior member who'd skimmed money from a shipment. Han Du-shik looked at her with the mild amusement adults reserve for children who have said something they think is clever. "Fairness isn't really the point, little one. Consequences are. But you punished him worse than the last person who did the same thing," Se-yeon said. "I heard you talking about it last month. That person only got a warning." The table went quiet. Taesung watched his lieutenant's expression shift from amusement to something colder. "Different circumstances," Du-shik said. "What circumstances?" Se-yeon pressed. "You didn't explain any circumstances. You just decided he deserved worse." Taesung set down his chopsticks. "That's enough, Se-yeon." She looked at him, not with the obedience of a scolded child, but with the disappointment of someone who had expected better from him specifically. "You always say that when someone's about to answer a question they don't want to answer," she said, then excused herself from the table without waiting for permission. Du-shik laughed it off as childish impertinence. Taesung did not laugh. He sat with the discomfort of watching his daughter identify, at 12 years old, the exact rot at the center of how his organization dispensed justice, a rot he had built himself and never once questioned. She called him father for the first time that same year, though even then the word carried a weight that unsettled him. It was not affection freely given. It was something closer to a contract, a title she was choosing to hold him accountable to. "If I'm calling you that," she told him once, "then you have to actually earn it. Not just give me a house and food. That's not the same thing as being someone's father." "Then tell me what would be," he said. She thought about the question with the seriousness she gave everything. "Being honest," she said finally. even when the truth makes you look bad. He did not fully understand, at the time, how completely that single sentence would define the next 15 years of both their lives. By 14, Se-yeon had begun sitting in on business meetings she was never invited to, standing in doorways with her arms crossed, absorbing conversations about shipments and territory and enforcement with the same intensity other children reserved for television. Tae-sung's lawyers grew visibly uncomfortable when she was present, not because she said much, but because of the way she watched, cataloging inconsistencies the way she once cataloged bruises and exits. "Your business runs on fear," she told him one evening, apropos of nothing, while doing homework at his desk instead of her own. "Not respect, fear. And fear only works until someone's more afraid of something else, or stops being afraid at all. Then everything collapses at once." "That's a very confident opinion for someone doing algebra," he said. "It's not an opinion. It's just what happens. I've read about it. Empires that run on fear always fall apart the same way, from the inside, usually through someone the person in charge trusted completely." He should have dismissed it as a child repeating something from a book. Instead, something in his chest went tight in a way he could not explain, as if she had described a wound before it existed. It was around the same time that Han Du-shik's role in the organization deepened, and with it, a friction between him and Se-yeon that never fully resolved. Du-shik was efficient, loyal on the surface, unfailingly respectful to Tae-sung in every room that mattered. He was also, Se-yeon insisted repeatedly, the most dangerous person in the entire house. "He never disagrees with you," she told her father once, watching Du-shik through a cracked door as he oversaw the discipline of a junior member who had made a minor error. "That's not loyalty. That's patience. He's just waiting." "Waiting for what?" Tae-sung asked. She did not have an answer then. It would take her another decade to find one, though when she finally did, it would come with enough evidence to end a man's career in a single afternoon. At 17, having finished every tutoring program Tae-sung's money could arrange, Se-yeon made a request that unsettled him more than any threat a rival organization had ever managed. "I want to study law abroad," she said. "Somewhere with real courts. Somewhere I can learn how justice is actually supposed to work, not just how it works in this house." He should have refused. He should have kept her close, kept her exactly where he could see her, the way he had kept everything valuable to him for 30 years. Instead, he found himself saying yes, though he did not fully understand why until much later. Why law specifically, he asked her the night before she left. "You could study anything. Business, medicine, anything that would keep you comfortable." She was folding clothes into a suitcase with the same precision she brought to everything else. "Because someone in this family should decide what's actually fair," she said, "instead of what's convenient. And it's not going to be you. You've built your whole life around deciding what's convenient." "That's an insult," he said, though there was no heat in it. "It's an observation," she said, echoing words she had used on him a decade earlier, standing in the same house as a much smaller girl who had refused his money and demanded food instead. "You taught me that." She left 3 weeks after her 18th birthday, carrying 2 suitcases and a version of silence Tae-sung mistook, at the time, for simple homesickness in reverse, a girl relieved to finally put an ocean between herself and everything she had grown up watching. He would not understand how wrong that assumption was for another 15 years, standing in a courtroom, watching her walk to a bench in black robes with a face that no longer looked at him the way a daughter looks at a father. What he knew in the years that followed came only in fragments. A law degree from a university that stopped returning his calls after he tried to donate a research library in her name. A name that quietly vanished from every registry he had access to. Silence stretching out further each year where updates once used to be. He told his men, when they dared to ask, that his daughter was building her own life. It was true in a way none of them understood, and in a way even Tae-sung himself would not fully understand until the exact moment she called his courtroom to order 15 years later, and told an entire nation that she had no father in the room. Only a defendant. Back in Seoul, during those same years of silence, the organization Tae-sung had spent 3 decades building began to change in ways he did not immediately notice. Han Du-shik's influence grew steadily, quietly, the way rot grows in wood that looks solid from the outside. Internal disputes that once would have gone to Taesung directly began, instead, going through Dushik first, resolved with a swiftness and severity that unsettled even hardened men. Someone's been sloppy, Dushik would say whenever a discrepancy surfaced in the books, or a shipment came up short, or a junior member's loyalty came into question. Taesung believed him completely, the same way he had believed him for 15 years, without inspection, without question, the exact kind of trust that works precisely as well as the person exploiting it needs it to. It would take 3 formal tribunals, 2 mysterious deaths ruled accidental, and 1 very patient federal prosecutor before Taesung understood how completely that trust had been weaponized against him. And it would take his own daughter, sitting behind a judge's bench in black robes, to show him exactly how deep the rot had gone. The first tribunal that Han Dushik oversaw without consulting Taesung directly happened 8 years after Se-yeon left for the United States. A junior member named Park Jun-seo had been accused of skimming from a shipment moving through Incheon, the same port where Taesung had once found a starving girl in a warehouse a lifetime ago. Dushik brought the accusation to Taesung with documents already prepared, numbers already reconciled, a conclusion already reached. The evidence is clean, Dushik said, laying the papers across Taesung's desk. Jun-seo moved product without logging it correctly 3 separate times. I've already spoken to the other captains. Everyone agrees on the consequence. Taesung looked over the documents slowly. Something about the precision of it, the way every discrepancy lined up so neatly, so conveniently, itched at the back of his mind in a way he could not name. Where's Jun-seo now? He asked. Waiting outside, Dushik said. I told him you wanted to speak with him directly before anything was decided. That, at least, seemed reasonable to Taesung at the time. He called Jun-seo in himself. The young man who entered his office did not look like a thief. He looked like a man who had not slept in 3 days, his hands trembling slightly as he sat across from Taesung. I didn't take anything, Jun-seo said immediately, his voice cracking. I swear on my mother's life, I logged every shipment exactly the way I was trained to. Someone changed the numbers after I submitted them. I don't know who. I don't know why. Taesung studied him for a long moment. 30 years of reading liars across a desk had given him instincts sharper than most polygraph machines. And every instinct he had told him that Jun-seo was telling the truth. He set the documents down. Give me a week, he told Dushik. I want to look into this myself before anything happens to him. Dushik's expression did not change, not visibly, not in a way most people would have noticed. But Taesung, who had spent 3 decades reading the smallest shifts in men's faces, caught something there, a flicker of impatience, maybe even alarm. Of course, Dushik said smoothly, take whatever time you need. 3 days later, before Taesung's investigation had gone anywhere, Jun-seo was found dead in his apartment. An apparent suicide, a note beside him confessing to the theft in language that felt, to Taesung, subtly wrong the moment he read it. Too formal, too composed. Not the voice of a man in the middle of a breakdown. Tragic, Dushik said, when he brought Taesung the news. But it does resolve the matter cleanly. Taesung said nothing. He filed the discomfort away, the same way he had filed away 100 small unease over the years, telling himself it was grief distorting his instincts, telling himself Dushik had earned 15 years of trust and did not deserve suspicion over one uncomfortable coincidence. It was the second death, 2 years later, that made the discomfort impossible to ignore entirely, though even then, Taesung did not have proof of anything, only a slowly accumulating weight in his chest that told him something in his own house had gone wrong in a way he could not yet see. By the time Se-yeon had been gone 12 years, the organization's books had developed inconsistencies too large to attribute to simple human error. A shipment manifest here off by a percentage that should have been impossible. A partner in Busan who had been reliable for a decade suddenly avoiding every call. An audit, quietly requested by a rival syndicate circling Taesung's territory like a shark that had smelled blood in water nobody else could see yet. Someone's been sloppy, Dushik said again, the same words he had used a dozen times before, reviewing the discrepancies with the same calm, unhurried concern of a doctor delivering results he already knew. I'll handle it quietly, You have enough to worry about. Tae-sung, against every instinct that had begun quietly screaming at him for years, believed him one more time. That was the tragedy of loyalty built without inspection. It worked exactly as well as the person exploiting it needed it to. Over the following 2 years, the leak became a flood. Shell companies with forgettable names appeared across financial filings, each one eventually, inevitably, tracing back to accounts bearing Tae-sung's own signature. A signature Dushik had spent over a decade learning to forge with the patience of a man who had always intended to use it exactly once, exactly when it would matter most. Loyal captains who had once taken bullets for their boss without hesitation began finding reasons to avoid his eyes in hallways. Fear, once Tae-sung's greatest asset, had begun working against him, because fear does not distinguish between a boss under siege and a boss who has become the siege itself. It was during this slow unraveling that federal prosecutors, tipped off by the same rival syndicate that had first requested the audit, filed formal charges against Choi Tae-sung, charges built on evidence so clean, so perfectly documented, that any competent lawyer should have immediately suspected it had been engineered rather than discovered. His own legal team ran out of angles within the first 2 weeks. His lead attorney, a capable man in ordinary circumstances, wore the particular pallor of someone preparing to lose gracefully, because losing appeared to be the only option remaining on the table. Tae-sung sat in his office late one night, alone, staring at documents that seemed determined to prove he was a man he no longer entirely recognized, and thought, for the first time in 15 years, about a 9-year-old girl who had once told him, with complete confidence, that empires built on fear always collapse from the inside, usually through someone the person in charge trusted completely. She had been describing this exact moment before it had ever happened. He had simply not been listening closely enough at the time. He did not call her. He had promised himself, the day she left, that he would never chase her, never intrude on a life she had chosen to build without him watching over her shoulder. That promise had held for 15 years of silence, through a law degree he was never told about, through a name that vanished from every registry, through headlines that eventually filled the silence with cruelty dressed as insight. Even his own daughter couldn't stomach him, read one particularly vicious column, printed alongside a photograph of Tae-sung looking older than his years outside a courthouse for an unrelated matter, looking every inch the villain the story required him to be. His men expected him to hunt her down. He had crossed oceans for business partners who had insulted him at parties. Surely he would move mountains for a daughter who had vanished without a word. He did not move at all. She has the right to leave without being chased, he told the one lieutenant who dared to ask why he had not sent anyone to find her. It was not resignation. It was the closest thing to respect he knew how to offer, the same respect she had demanded of him beneath a warehouse light 15 years earlier, when she had refused his money and told him exactly what she needed instead. What none of them knew, what would not surface until a courtroom in Seoul filled with cameras and a prosecutor already tasting an easy victory, was that Se-yeon had not simply been building her own life somewhere far away. She had been building toward this exact moment for over a decade, quietly, patiently, with the same discipline she had once used to catalog every guard, every bruise, every unfair punishment inside a house she was never meant to survive, let alone understand. She had found the first shell company 7 years into her career, buried in a filing she had pulled purely out of professional habit while working a completely unrelated case. The name meant nothing to any of her colleagues. To her, trained since childhood to notice exactly this kind of boring, deliberate camouflage, it meant everything. She did not call her father. Calling would have meant explaining. Explaining too early would have meant losing the only advantage she had, which was time, and the element of surprise that came from being underestimated by every single person who assumed she had simply disappeared. By the time Seoul prosecutors filed formal charges against Choi Tae-sung, Se-yeon had spent 3 years quietly building a career specifically positioned within the exact court district that would eventually hold jurisdiction over cases involving organizations like her father's. She had turned down 2 prestigious appointments elsewhere, appointments that would have advanced her career considerably faster, because neither of them would have put her anywhere near the bench she needed to be sitting behind when this exact case finally arrived. Nobody, least of all Han Du-shik, expected the vanished daughter to be the one holding the gavel that would end him. The morning the trial began, Seoul's Central District Court filled 2 hours before doors officially opened. Reporters staked out seats like it was a championship match. Rival syndicate members sat scattered through the gallery, not bothering to hide their satisfaction, dressed for the occasion like men attending a funeral they had personally arranged. Choi Tae-sung sat at the defense table in a suit that no longer fit him quite the way it once had. Not physically, but in the way clothes stop fitting a man who has spent months absorbing blow after blow with no way to strike back. Across the aisle, the lead prosecutor reviewed his notes one final time with the relaxed thoroughness of a man checking a bag he already knew was packed correctly. Then the bailiff's voice cut through the room. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Se-yeon Choi." Tae-sung's lawyer turned to him immediately, confusion written across his face. "Did you know a Choi was presiding over this case?" he whispered. Tae-sung said nothing. He could not have spoken even if he wanted to. He was staring at the woman walking toward the bench in black robes, and for one full second, his mind refused to process what his eyes were showing him. The way a body sometimes recognizes a person before the brain catches up with the shock of it. She did not look at him the way she once had. There was no softness in her expression, no flicker of the girl who used to argue with him over dinner about fairness and consequences. There was only the composed, unreadable calm of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment more times than she would ever admit out loud. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, rising slightly, "we'd like to note for the record that the defendant's last name is also Choi. Is there a relation the court should be aware of?" The entire gallery went silent, waiting. Se-yeon set down her folder with deliberate calm. She did not blink. "There is no relation the court needs to disclose that would affect these proceedings," she said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "I have no father in this room. I only have a defendant." Somewhere in the gallery, a woman gasped audibly. Tae-sung's hands, folded on the table in front of him, began to shake, something that had not happened to him in 30 years of sitting across from men who wanted him dead. His lawyer leaned in close, whispering urgently, "If she's your daughter, we can request she recuse herself. This could work in our favor. A judge with a personal connection isn't supposed to preside over—" "I don't want her removed," Tae-sung said quietly, cutting him off. "Whatever she decides in this room, I want it to be her." His lawyer stared at him like he had lost his mind entirely. "Do you understand what you're saying? She could destroy you in there and nobody would question it. Nobody would even blame her for it." Tae-sung kept his eyes on the woman behind the bench. "Then let her," he said. "If anyone in this world has earned the right to decide what happens to me, it's her." The judge called the court to order, and the trial began in earnest. The prosecution's case unfolded exactly as smoothly as everyone had expected. Manifests entered into evidence. Laundered accounts meticulously documented. A forged signature verified by an expert witness who spoke with the flat, unwavering confidence of a man who had never once questioned who might have taught the forger to be so precise in the first place. Han Du-shik sat in the gallery as a witness for the prosecution, his composure perfect, his expression appropriately grave, a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how to look like grief when what he actually felt was something closer to relief. Se-yeon watched him throughout the morning's proceedings with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. It was during the cross-examination of the forensic accountant, hours into the first day, that she finally spoke directly for the first time beyond procedural instruction. "Dr. Han," she said, addressing the expert witness, "you testified that the defendant's signature appears on 12 separate account authorizations connected to the shell companies in question." "Correct." "That's correct, Your Honor. And in your professional opinion, based purely on the signature analysis alone, is there any way to determine when those signatures were actually placed on the documents versus when the documents themselves claim to have been signed?" The witness hesitated. "That would require a separate forensic dating analysis of the ink and paper itself. Signature analysis alone can't establish timeline." Se-yeon nodded slowly. "Then let the record show that this court will require exactly that analysis before any of these documents can be considered reliable evidence of when they were actually created," she said. "I want independent forensic dating on all 12 documents, conducted by a laboratory neither the prosecution nor the defense has previously used." We'll reconvene once those results are available. The prosecutor rose immediately. Your Honor, this will delay proceedings considerably, and the defense hasn't raised any formal challenge to the authenticity of— The defense doesn't need to raise the challenge, Se-Yun said, her voice calm but absolute. I'm raising it. This court has an obligation to verify evidence thoroughly before allowing it to determine a man's freedom, regardless of who requests that scrutiny or who benefits from it. That's not a favor to the defendant. That's simply the job. The prosecutor sat back down slowly, something uncertain crossing his face for the first time since the trial had begun. In the gallery, Han Du-shik shifted almost imperceptibly in his seat, though Tae-sung, watching him with the same careful attention he had spent 30 years perfecting, caught it immediately. It was the first crack, small and nearly invisible, in 30 years of practiced composure.